In addition to our written columns, which are archived at danielgordis.substack.com, Israel from the Inside will also be posting a video series on the history of Israel, as well as regular podcasts that will shine light on a variety of subjects that make up the mosaic of Israeli life. In this episode, taken from a Zoom conference that I did for an American community, we're providing the second of two brief videos on the factors that led up to the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas. In the first video, we looked at the more distant history that set the stage for the conflict, while in this segment, we will look at the variety of immediate factors that combined to create the perfect storm that led to the fighting. You're welcome to share this video. It's easily accessible on YouTube, and you should feel free to share the link with anyone who might wish to understand the background that led to this sad but very important conflict.
What happened now? I mean, why did this thing actually blow up now? And here we can say there was really a kind of a perfect storm. I'll talk about what those factors were, and then in a minute or two, I want to talk about who had a vested interest in seeing this explode, or if not in seeing this explode, certainly in stoking the flames of Israeli, Arab, and Jewish tensions inside Israel, which then in the end led to this. What happened here? Well, first of all, Ramadan, which is the holiest month of the Muslim calendar, is always a tense time in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, particularly in East Jerusalem and around the Old City. And because of intelligence warnings that there were people planning violence, Israel put metal detectors outside the Damascus Gate, which is one of the gates that many of the Muslims who go to pray on the Temple Mount at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and around the mosque during Ramadan use. These metal detectors, which obviously you go through every time you go through an airport, very often you go to them in other kinds of places. Certainly if you're going to go to try to see the Capitol building these days, or the White House and go on a tour, or many different buildings in Midtown Manhattan, these metal detectors to Israelis seem rather innocuous, but they are an affront to Muslims who see Israel's stationing these detectors outside the Damascus Gate as a kind of violation of their autonomy or a violation of their sovereignty over that part of the Temple Mount, even though, of course, these metal detectors are not on the Temple Mount at all. They're actually outside the walls of the Old City. But nonetheless, that was one factor that led to a tremendous amount of tension building up. Then there was what you have no doubt heard about, which was what everybody calls a pending eviction from the community of Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is an Arab neighborhood in East Jerusalem. According to Israeli law, Jews who had deeds of ownership from before 1948 and then had that land taken away from them can theoretically still claim that land back or those houses back if they can prove that it was theirs before it was taken by the invading Jordanian army. Now, there's been lots of cases like this, and it's very important when people say in the newspaper there was this impending eviction. That's actually completely false. Everybody was waiting for the Supreme Court in Israel to rule on this case. And obviously, if both sides didn't have a fairly strong case, it would never have reached the Supreme Court. It was obviously a complicated case, and the Supreme Court, in the days right before the violence broke out, announced that it was going to delay its decision because it understood that no matter which way it ruled, it was going to contribute to the tensions, and it wanted nothing to do with that. So we still don't have the Supreme Court ruling. But when you say that here that there was an impending eviction, that's actually just not true. There had been no decision made about whether or not there would be an eviction, and what will happen now, of course, remains to be seen once the Supreme Court picks it up once again. Then the two calendars, the Muslim calendar and the Jewish calendar, coincided with the end of Ramadan, a 3-day holiday called Eid al-Fitr, which is the Arabic, one of the 3 days of the most holy in the Muslim calendar, coincided with Yom Yerushalayim, which is Jerusalem Unification Day. The celebration of Jerusalem's unification, which of course goes back to 1967 during the Six-Day War, has become a holiday which many of us actually celebrate the miracle of Jerusalem being unified. But it's important to acknowledge that there are certain groups in Israel that turned this into a somewhat more nationalistic demonstration. And for years and years and years, there's been a tradition, there's nothing illegal about it at all, of young Israeli kids in youth movements and so on and so forth, taking Israeli flags and marching around the walls of the entire Old City, which of course takes them well into East Jerusalem on the other side of the Old City, which some people, myself included, feel is probably not a terribly smart idea because it's poking your thumb in the eye of people. And especially this year, we thought it wasn't a great idea. When violence began to break out just on the Temple Mount, and heavily armed Israeli police actually had to storm the Al-Aqsa Mosque because stones were being thrown from there and weapons were apparently being stored there. When the Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Hamas, which is nowhere near Jerusalem, you remember the map, Hamas is off to the southwest. Jerusalem is on the eastern side. But Hamas, which is not at all adjacent to Jerusalem, announced that if Israel did not get all of its troops out of the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque by 6 p.m. last Monday, it was going to fire rockets at Jerusalem. A, nobody believed them. And B, even if somebody had believed them, obviously Israel can't say, oh my God, Hamas has threatened us, we're going to have to back down. There's no way. Now, I was actually, as I wrote on a blog that you might have seen, I was actually out riding my bike in an Arab village at 6 o'clock on a week ago, Monday. 2 weeks ago, I guess it was. Now, 2 weeks ago tomorrow. I was actually out riding my bike. I heard the warnings from Hamas, but like most Israelis, didn't really take it seriously until I heard the air raid sirens. And then, of course, the explosion of the rockets near Jerusalem. They didn't fire right at Jerusalem, of course, because if they make a mistake and they hit anything in the old city or the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it would be a complete disaster. So they fire in their environment. But of course, Israel cannot let a foreign entity begin to fire rockets at its capital without responding, right? I mean, it's very hard to imagine, but imagine that Canada was very different than Canada is, or Mexico was very different than Mexico is, and they started firing missiles or rockets at Washington, D.C. The United States cannot allow that to pass. It is going to try to figure out who is firing those rockets, and it's going to crush them. Now, Israel didn't crush Hamas, but it did fire back much more heavily in the early stages than Hamas ever expected it to. And then Israel probably assumed that Hamas was going to back down, but Hamas upped the ante. And this was one of those games of chicken where kind of everything went wrong. And before you knew it, we were in a kind of a full-fledged war, at least on that front, for just under 2 weeks. But why did Hamas issue that warning 2 weeks ago tomorrow? Why did Hamas say, if you don't get out by 6 p.m., we're going to fire rockets at Jerusalem? Why would they do this? And why, by the way, was Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank, which is the east side of Israel, why was Mahmoud Abbas also stoking the flames? What did these various entities have to gain by stoking the flames in Jerusalem, which eventually erupted and took things much further than anybody hoped that they would? Well, Mahmoud Abbas was elected in 2005 for a 4-year term. In January of 2005, Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the Palestinian Authority for a 4-year term, which means he is now in the 16th year of that 4-year term. He's never called elections. He's never allowed them to happen. He announced several months ago that he was going to call elections for this May, right now, this month. Everybody in Israel knew that he was going to cancel them for one reason or another. He found an excuse to cancel them. He understood that if he held them, he was going to lose to Hamas. So the truth was that Israel wasn't terribly sorry to see the elections canceled, because we also don't want Hamas taking over the West Bank, just like it did Gaza. So with a nod from Israel, Israel didn't intervene. He canceled the elections, but was very anxious to have the spotlight in this area move away from his canceled elections to something else. The more that there was violence stoked in East Jerusalem or in the environment of Jerusalem, the more people forgot about his canceled election, and that served him very well. Hamas, in the meantime, off on the southwest, was really challenged by the Abraham Accords, because we don't think about this a lot, but what the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain, and then, of course, Morocco and Sudan began to follow suit. Saudi Arabia began to make noises about accommodating some sort of relationship with Israel. What all of this did was it said to the Palestinians, we're moving on. We've waited long enough for you to make a deal with the Israelis. We're not waiting anymore. Israel's not going anywhere. Israel's here to stay. It's a technological powerhouse. It's a financially very significant country. We want their tourists. We want people to be able to go from here to there and there to here. We're not waiting anymore. We're signing a peace treaty, which of course infuriated the Palestinian community and made Hamas feel that the Palestinians in general, and it in particular, were being marginalized and completely put off the international scene. Then when Israeli Arabs in these last elections began to get more and more involved, and you may recall that right before this violence broke out, it looked like Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett were going to be able to create a government that would have unseated Bibi Netanyahu. And the reason they were going to be able to do that was that Ra'am, a relatively radical Arab party, which is distinctly non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist, was willing to join with them. So here you had Israeli Arabs about to determine who was going to be the prime minister of the Jewish state. Something to remember, by the way, when someone tells you it's an apartheid state. But here you had Israeli Arabs also basically accepting the reality of Israel and even beginning to participate much more than they had before in the political process. So if you're Hamas, you're watching basically as the world leaves you behind. The Arab world, first with Egypt in 78, 79, left you behind. Then Jordan in 1994 leaves you behind. Now in 2020, Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco, Sudan, and the beginnings of Saudi Arabia leave you behind. Then Israeli Arabs say we actually have to move on and start getting involved. You begin to see, if you're Hamas, that you've waited too long, that simply the world has gotten tired of the Palestinians delaying any kind of an accommodation, and it's time to move on. Hamas needs to do exactly what it did. It needs to portray itself to the Arab world as the protector of Al-Aqsa. Mahmoud Abbas is in his early 80s. He's a fairly weakened political authority. Nobody takes him all that seriously anymore. For him to claim that he's kind of the international protector of Al-Aqsa would be laughable. But as you can see, Hamas is hardly laughable. And so what they have been able to do is to reposition themselves very much as the kind of protector of Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, East Jerusalem. They're kind of the godfather looking out for the rest of Palestinians. And of course, we're talking about Hamas, which we were not doing 3 weeks ago and 3 months ago and even 3 years ago. Nobody's been talking about the Palestinians for a very long time. And they understood that the only way to get us talking about them, the only way to get back into the scene, so to speak, was going to be to declare this war effectively, or to cause this war, or to fire at Jerusalem. At the end of the day, it escalated faster than they thought it would. It escalated faster than Israel thought it would. It was a tragic loss of life on both sides. Obviously, the loss of life was greater on the side of Gaza, because Gaza puts its guns and its rockets right in the middle of civilian areas on purpose. Israel tried very hard not to kill people when at all possible, but tragically there were lives lost. We understand that. A small fraction of the number that were killed in 2014, but still there was loss of life. And I don't know a single Israeli who was not deeply saddened by the pictures that Israeli news showed of Gazan suffering. I'm not sure how much Israeli suffering figured on the nightly news in Gaza, but videos of families fleeing and of children crying, which were really heartbreaking, that took place in Gaza, were shown on Israeli television. And you'd have to have a heart of stone to watch that and not feel something. But at the end of the day, Israelis, as much as they were saddened by it, understood what I said earlier. This was simply the latest battle in the war of independence. Hamas is sworn and our destruction. And therefore, what you really have in this region is one group deciding that, or determined to kill the Jews, and the Jews determined not to be killed. The Jews are not going to compromise. And until Hamas compromises on that fundamental goal, this is where we are. And the horrors that we saw the last 2 weeks will repeat themselves time and again. There are some people, I'll just say as an aside, there were some people who argue that even inside Israeli politics, there were those who had a vested interest in stoking the flames of Jerusalem, right-wing Israeli politicians who did not want to see a coalition formed with that Arab party. Ra'am thought, you know what, let's stoke the fires a little bit. Maybe we'll get a little bit of low-grade violence inside Jerusalem. That'll make it impossible for Naftali Bennett, who's basically a man of the right, but just wants to unseat Bibi. He won't be able to sit with Mahmoud Abbas, with Mansour Abbas, the head of Ra'am, anymore. There are people who actually cynically say that maybe Bibi Netanyahu himself, who had basically, for all intents and purposes, lost this last election and was about to see the opposition create a coalition. Some people say, I'm not taking a stand, but some people say he had a vested interest in trying to shake things up a little bit, not going to war, but just making people nervous enough that maybe some of those politicians in Israel who were willing to sit in a coalition with Mansour Abbas, the head of Ra'am, might not be willing to do that. So there were factors on the Arab side, both in Hamas and in the West Bank. There were factors on the Jewish side. Everybody had a little bit of something to gain from seeing a little bit of tension in Jerusalem, tragically, it went far beyond what anybody thought it would, and we ended up with a war that just ended a few days ago. So we find ourselves here in a very sad time in Israel. We had just come out of COVID. COVID in Israel is over. There are no restrictions, none. Theaters are open, museums are open, restaurants are open, weddings happen without any masks. You see virtually no masks anywhere. A few people who might be a little bit more, vulnerable are wearing masks. But until there's a variant, God forbid, that the vaccine is not effective against, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of Israeli adults have been vaccinated. We're now vaccinating people between 12 and 15. So really, the country is fundamentally protected against COVID. And we really felt like we were coming back to normalcy after a long time, as you yourselves have felt, of not being in normal life. Unfortunately, we were out for very few weeks before this war broke out. And this is very much a kind of a country that feels sucker punched. It was in lockdown because of COVID for 14, 15 months, whatever it was, a couple of weeks to breathe, and then a war. Now a tremendous amount of work to do to try to rebuild this society. But I'll just quote Golda Meir. Golda Meir would always say that the Jews had a secret weapon in their conflict with the Arab world. And that secret weapon was that we had nowhere else to go. There's nowhere for the Jews to go. So that's why, at the end of the day, we're going to do what we have to do to stay alive here. We hope and pray that it does not require violence, but if and when violence is forced on us, we're going to do what we have to do in the same way that any other people would do what they had to do to try to defend their homes. My hope and my prayer on the outside is that Hamas will understand that there is no defeating Israel militarily, so they can either keep their population locked in this deadly conflict, wasting billions of dollars on tunnels that we're only going to destroy instead of building schools and hospitals. My hope is that they're going to decide that that's useless. It's time to make a deal. That's my hope and my prayer. And inside Israel, it's my hope and my prayer that we can do the work together, Jews and Arabs alike, that we need to do to heal this society so that the difficult days that we just recently witnessed will be a very bad memory, but certainly not one that will repeat itself.
To receive notice of columns, podcasts, and videos as they're posted, sign up at danielgordis.substack.com. Thanks for joining us.